We've all been watching, if I may add, mostly with a great deal of dismay, the kerfuffle over the statements that two BJP spokespersons made about the holy prophet of the Muslims that a lot of the Muslim countries, Muslim people have taken objection to. Now, suddenly, Government of India has responded, they've tried to make amends, they have sacked one of these spokespersons, suspended the other, and there are a lot of statements being made by Government of India, by the MEA now, and before that by Indian embassies in some Gulf countries also, saying that these are fringe elements. Now, whether fringe elements are defined as spokesmen of your party and vice versa, those are different arguments. Now, this raises two issues. So, one set of the issues is moral and philosophical. How does the government respond to the same protest by some Islamic countries, but not by Muslims of our own country? After all, 20 crore Muslims also live in India, and if they are upset about it, why did the government not respond to them for so many days? Why did it wait for this long when this became an international issue? And once it became an international issue, how quickly did it move in to make amends? Now, philosophical and moral issues are what we deal with opinion. And if you've been tracking the print, you know our view on that. I'm not going to repeat that here. I am going to pick up the facts. Cut the Clutter is about picking up the facts and try and explaining them. And one, telling you why something happened, what does it mean, and what do you expect here on. So the important thing is, look at the alacrity with which Government of India responded to these protests from, to begin with Qatar, then Kuwait, then Saudi Arabia, and then more. Immediately, a decision was taken. First, the BJP issued a statement saying that they distanced themselves from these statements. Then they might have thought that with this, the storm will blow away, but that didn't happen. Then they sacked from the party, primary membership, one of the spokespersons, and suspended the other. And they thought this will now die out. It did not die out. Indian ambassadors got summoned in these countries, also in Iran. And that became a first-rate diplomatic crisis late on Sunday evening for South Bloc. Now, important thing is, just last week, we had also given you an episode of Cut the Clutter on the US State Department's International Religious Freedom Report. That report was released by none else than US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He had made some unkind or uncharitable remarks about India. Now, what happened after that? Government of India did not suddenly rush to make amends. Government of India actually answered back, and see this statement from the MEA, which actually held up the mirror to the Americans and said, listen, think about your own race crimes, think about your own gun crimes, etc., etc., etc. Who the hell are you to lecture us? We are perfectly capable of handling our own issues. So that was an aggressive India which hit back. We've also seen our External Affairs Minister Shekhar similarly handle questions on those issues, including human rights issues, saying that we might also have some concerns about human rights issues in America. Again, in Europe, when asked questions about why questions insinuating that India was fence-sitting on the Ukraine issue, again, he hit back in kind, and that is something that's very popular on social media, on Indian media. Generally, we have that speech or that discussion on our website in our ThePrint Uncut series, and I'll share it with you. I think it's heading for 500,000 views. So those were different kinds of reactions. In this case, an exactly opposite kind of reaction has taken place. Government of India, instead of lecturing back these countries that who the hell are you to tell us how to deal with diversity, are actually Government of India is bending over backwards to assuage their feelings. Now, you might say that, all right, this is the Islamic world, and Islamic world is very significant. Muslims are 200 crore people in the world. That is 2 billion people. That's a lot of people. That's about 23% of all the world's population. And they are spread in many countries. Many countries are Muslim majority countries. So obviously, India does not want to make them all angry. But let me give you a couple more factual points. For example, look at the 10 countries with the highest Muslim population in that order, 1 to 10. So number 1, as we know, is Indonesia with a little over 23 crores. Then comes Pakistan with about 22 crores, India with 21 crores, Bangladesh with about 15.5 crores, Nigeria about 10 crores, Egypt again about 10 crores, Iraq 8 crores. These are all ballpark figures. Turkey 7.5 crores, and then we come to Algeria, Sudan. These are sort of in the 3.5 to 4 crore ballpark. Now, none of these countries, barring Iran, none of these countries has complained or protested about these statements. And let me tell you, it isn't essentially because of Iran's protests that India is making such a heavy correction on this one. It is because some other countries have spoken out. And what are these countries? These are Qatar. This is Saudi Arabia. This is Kuwait, right? And linked with them is also UAE. So these countries have protested, and because of those protests, essentially, it is because of those protests that government of India has responded with such alacrity. Now, these are not the biggest Islamic populations. In fact, these are also not the country which have the largest Muslim population by way of percentage of their overall population. Once again, if I give you a list of the 10 countries with the highest percentage of Muslim population, there will be Maldives, 100%. Maldives National Parliament, by the way, rejected a motion on this to discuss this. Maldives is 100%. Mauritania, that is where the cleric who was a kind of teacher for Osama bin Laden and who gave the ideological underpinning to Al-Qaeda, he came in from Mauritania. So Maldives is 100%, Mauritania is 99.9%, Somalia is 99.8%, Tunisia is 99.8%, Afghanistan 99.7%, Algeria, Iran, Yemen, Morocco, Niger, Turkey, all in the 99% bracket. What is it about these smaller Gulf countries? They have very small population. In fact, in the group of countries, 7 countries that form the Gulf Cooperation Council, in that group, the population is not even 2% of the global Muslim population. And yet, this protest from them has got India so shaken. Why has that happened? So it's a 6-member GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, which came into being in 1981. That is where the protest is coming from, and these 6 nations account for just about 2% of the global Muslim population. Why is India then immediately reacting to them? By the way, these 6 countries are UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, and Bahrain. Now, you might say that's because a lot of Indians work there. It is true that a lot of Indians work there. If you look at the total number of Indians working across the world, or sort of NRIs as we call them, or overseas Indians, that is about 31 million. That is 3.1 crores, of which 8.5 million, that is more than 1/4, are only in these tiny Gulf countries. So that's a lot of people in a few small population countries, but these are rich countries. So they also send a lot of money back home, which runs into tens of billions of dollars. In fact, you will see on the screen some data on the amount of remittances that come into India from the Gulf region, the total remittances and what comes from the Gulf region. It is very significant. In fact, once again, if you want to see the numbers, basic numbers, these are all ballpark numbers. UAE, for example, will have about 32 to 33 lakh Indian workers. That is 3.2 million. Saudi Arabia, about 3 million, about 28, 29 lakhs. Kuwait, about 1 million. Then Oman and Qatar, about 7 lakhs each. Bahrain, a little over 3 lakhs. So these are people, a lot of Indian families depend on incomes from their family members working in the Gulf countries. So you might say that makes it very important for India. Or you will say that it's trade. India-UAE trade is very high. In fact, India's trade with UAE is the highest of India's trade with any other group. It's been higher historically, at least for the past many years, than India-EU trade and also India-ASEAN trade. It has declined a little bit over the last couple of years, particularly because of the pandemic, but generally it's been quite high. It's been generally in the 90 billion to $100 billion bracket. Now, is that the important thing? The point is, all these things matter, but something else matters. And what that something else is, it is strategic interest. Now, look at the map of the world. We are just showing you the part of the world that comprises what is generally called the Middle East. In fact, if you go to MEA has for a long time had a division called MENA, MENA, that is Middle East and North Africa. So if you see the Middle Eastern region, so there is sort of the Arabian Peninsula in the middle where these GCC countries are located. In fact, the only country in the Arabian Peninsula which is not a member of the GCC is Yemen. And we know what's happening in Yemen right now. There's a proxy war going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia with its Western allies there at this point as we speak. North of the Arabian Peninsula, then you get into Jordan and Israel and that slightly tricky region where you cross into Egypt across Suez Canal, and then there's a little bit of Asia and then Africa. Once again, if you look at this peninsula, it's abutted by two seas. There is the Arabian Gulf or Persian Gulf, depending on which side you are on, to the east of which is Iran, which is also part of the Middle East, but also a Gulf country, but not a member of the GCC. And there are serious issues there, which I will come to. Then there is the Red Sea. To the west of the Arabian Peninsula, there is the Red Sea. And across Red Sea is then Africa. These African countries also have largely Muslim and in some cases mostly Arab populations. So you see Egypt, you see Sudan, and then if you go beyond Egypt, then you get to Libya and all that, but then you're going really far. So this is one region with essentially one faith, inhabited by one faith, with very few Jews thrown in the middle, but with many, many divisions and differences between them. 2011 is when Arab Spring took place. And Arab Spring took place, it took Hosni Mubarak out. That was the biggest impact of the Arab Spring. So Egypt lost its stability, political stability. And after that, an election took place. Election handed over the power to Muslim Brotherhood, which nobody wanted. And once again, Egypt went through upheavals. And now it is run by a government, which is by no means a democratic government. But what happened as a result of that, and read this article that I'm sharing with you on ORF by Talmiz Ahmad, who's a former Indian diplomat, a very respected diplomat, also our former ambassador to Saudi Arabia. In that article, he points out that with Arab Spring and with the decline of Egyptian power, Hosni Mubarak, Saudi Arabia lost its main ally, its main security ally in the region. So Saudis had to fend for themselves a lot more than they had done in the past. And Saudis are a very insecure country because they're a very large country with small population. It's run by a monarchy. And what the Saudis are afraid of most of all, which is surprising or counterintuitive given the fact that Saudis finance so many mosques and they have traditionally financed so much Wahhabi, very traditional, very conservative Islam all over the world, including in India. But what they fear most of all is Islamism. So Arab Spring, for example, brought in a big phobia in Saudi Arabia as well, because that is the last thing they wanted in their region. Now, with the decline of Egypt as one balancing power in the region, it also opened up the region to Iranian influence. I told you, Iran is also part of the Middle East. It's also a Gulf country, but that Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf also divides the Middle Eastern region on sectarian grounds. So Iran is a Shia country and the other Gulf countries are essentially mostly Sunni countries. So Iran now started using its own ideological and sectarian power to now infiltrate into areas where Arab Spring had thrown up openings. Syria, for example, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. And that is when proxy wars started. These were proxy wars between the Iranians and the Saudis, backed by their Western patrons, in Syria, in Yemen, and also in Iraq. And that's been going on. Sometimes these go up, sometimes these go down. In Syria, for example, even the Russians have got involved. So it is quite a messy situation. All of this Saudi Arabia worries about a great deal. That's the reason they are fighting. In Yemen, from Yemen, as we know, attacks have also been launched, missile attacks have also been launched on UAE. So UAE also has its security issues. Qatar, on the other hand, plays it very cleverly. Qatar is a member of GCC. It's a tiny country of just about 3 million people, but it follows a very independent foreign policy where it shares a very warm relationship with Iran. They even share a huge gas field. It gives refuge to Osama bin Laden's family. It's also home to America's largest air base in the region and the US Central Command's sort of field headquarters or tactical headquarters. So with all that, Qatar also becomes a very strategic nation. Now for India, is India bothered by all this? Does India bother what's happening between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or what's happening between the Americans and Iran and that region? Why can't India just be distant from all this? सिकंदर ने पोरस से की थी लड़ाई, जो की थी लड़ाई तो मैं क्या करूं? Maybe India can. But remember that this region is also west of Pakistan. For far too long, for almost 50, 60 years, Pakistanis have relied on the Gulf region, the same rich Gulf countries, to sustain it with money, with employment for its people, which also creates a remittance economy. Pakistan's very dependent on that, but also a lot of strategic support. So anytime there's been conflict between India and Pakistan, the Arab world, by and large, has leaned on Pakistan's side. There is no doubt about that. In fact, that is one of the big issues with the kind of non-aligned policy, or what was called non-aligned policy, that Nehru had followed, because one of the three pillars of that non-aligned movement was Nasser, the leader of Egypt. Other was Tito, besides indeed Nehru. Now, that was a time when Nasser was a kind of secular leader. In fact, you might have seen videos of Nasser making fun of hijab, etc. So Nasser was one of the Ba'athist leaders, as Saddam Hussein was. Reasonably secular or quite secular, modern, dictatorial. But he wasn't pro-India. So in fact, through the 60s and early 70s, as India had trouble with Pakistan, Egypt, whether under Nasser or after, never spoke a word in India's favor. So that was a very different Middle East. What has happened over time is, as India's economic strength has grown and as Pakistan's has declined, Pakistan's economic strength, Pakistan's political strength, Pakistan's strategic value have all declined, or what is called as gross national power or comprehensive national power. GNP or CNP in Pakistan's case is declined, just as India has increased. And as that has happened, these small but powerful and super rich Gulf countries have also made their adjustments, and Indian policy has reached out to them. It didn't start with Narendra Modi, although I must say he accelerated it a great deal. It started in Vajpayee's times, then Manmohan Singh's time it picked up. 2006 Republic Day, our chief guest was Saudi king at that point, and that was the first time a Saudi king had come visiting India after King Saud in 1955, and you will see some pictures and tweets on that. In fact, a foundation runs a Twitter handle in his name because he was like the founder of modern Saudi Arabia, and that also has some pictures and one of his statements. In fact, in 1955, he had made a statement that he believes that Muslims are safe in the Indian system. Nevertheless, 1955, then 2006, again a Saudi king came, and this time he came as the chief guest on India's Republic Day. That is when India and Saudi Arabia signed what was called the Delhi Declaration. That started giving a strategic foundation to the relationship. After that, Dr. Manmohan Singh visited Saudi Arabia in 2010, and that led to the Riyadh Declaration. Riyadh Declaration clearly stated that the two countries were now strategic allies. And remember, many things have happened after that. Many we know, many we don't know. Some we can tell you about, some we can't tell you about because the sources or that information may be privileged. But this has been a very valuable strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia, with UAE, and generally with GCC countries. Just to give you an example, that Abu Jundal, remember the terrorist, who is supposed to have been among those controlling the 26/11 attackers. Because in those voice recordings, those audio recordings, my colleague Praveen Swami has those recordings, and if you hear them, you can figure out that one of those voices is not like a Pakistani voice with a typical Punjabi tinge. That looks like very much like an Indian voice, like a Hindustani voice. That voice apparently was Abu Jundal, whose real name is Zabihuddin Ansari. Now, there's a very interesting story as to how he was brought back to India, because Saudi Arabia and India had now signed an extradition treaty. So if he was an Indian citizen and wanted for a terror case, Saudi Arabia was going to extradite him, but the Pakistanis tried to say that no, he's a Pakistani, you can't extradite him to India. And there is a very interesting story on how India managed to get him by proving that he's an Indian citizen. That someday Praveen Swami will tell you. So I'll leave it to him. Now, internationally, globally, how is India inclined or linked? I will not say aligned, right? Because that's a sensitive word. Inclined or linked, or where does India lean strategically? India leans towards Western powers. What is the Quad? Quad is about Western powers, India aligning with Western powers. Again, even in the Middle East, even in the Gulf region, at the other end, the northern end of the Gulf region is Israel, and Israel is among India's closest strategic allies. The most important foreign policy achievement of the Trump era was the signing of the Abraham Accords. Now, with these Abraham Accords, Israel, Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the key countries, the US, they've all come closer together. India is pretty much a part of the larger grouping there, and that's the reason anything that embarrasses the ruling regimes of these countries is very damaging to India's strategic and foreign policy interests. And that is the reason you find this government acting with such a sense of urgency.